Welcome back to In the Moment. I'm Lori Walsh. Today is the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Patrick Hicks is a writer in residence at Augustana University. He's a scholar. He's the author of the poetry collection, A Library of the Mind, the novel, The Commandant of Lubazec, and the short story collection, The Collector of Names. And he's joining us now from the STPB Sioux Falls studios while we're broadcasting live from the STPB Rapid City studios to talk about this historic day and what happened at Auschwitz and why it's important for us to remember it. Patrick, welcome back. Thanks for being here.
Oh, it's always my pleasure.
Everyone has a story of sort of the first time that they heard about these places, these death camps, extermination camps. Your story goes back to childhood, and I'm hoping that you can tell it a little bit now today, even though you've written about it before, because it also ties into some other things that are happening today socially. Is you thought one thing, and then you woke up and thought something else, even as a young child.
Yeah. I remember I was pretty young, maybe 9 or 10 years old, when I saw footage for the first time of the Holocaust, and it was not of Auschwitz. It was these black and white video footage that I now know was taken by the British Army at Bergen-Belsen, but it was these really now iconic photos of the bulldozers, moving these emaciated skeletal bodies into these massive graves. And that really shook me as a 9 or a 10-year-old. And, at that point in time, we're talking about the late 1970s. The Holocaust was not that far removed from where I was in time, because I'm now 50. So it was really shocking to me that something like that could have happened in such recent history. And it really did change me, and it made me curious about how it could happen and curious about how we could make sure that it couldn't happen again. And it was really the beginning of a lifelong study of the Holocaust in general.
Because before that time, you as a little boy were kind of thinking, the aircraft, the swastika, these sort of like just a cool kind of, a cool thing to be fascinated with. And then suddenly you realized what it all meant and how it fit together with cruelty and evil and what we're capable of.
Yeah, I was one of these nerdy kids that, I was building like model airplanes and things like that. And for me, at that point in time of my life, the German planes from World War II, they were just cooler. The Germans, they invented the first jet aircraft, and they were sleek, and so I really enjoyed building the aircraft, and I kind of knew sort of vaguely in the background that these awful things have been happening, but it wasn't until I was confronted by that visual proof that it just fundamentally transformed everything for me. And I went from sort of admiring those planes from an aesthetic perspective of aerodynamics and wow, they're really cool, to just being really repulsed by the war machine that they represent and the subsequent genocide that followed in their wake.
Tell us what happened on January 27th, 75 years ago. Where are we at in the war? And then the Soviet Army comes to liberate this camp. Did we have any idea of what exactly the scope and the scale of what was going on there? Take us back to that time in history, if you would.
Well, at that point in time, January 27, 1945, when Auschwitz was liberated, it wasn't covered all that much. It didn't make much of a news splash, I suppose, because you have the Soviet army approaching from the east, and by this time you have the Americans and the British coming up through Italy, but also now pushing with some speed from the Western Front, because D-Day happened only a few months previous to this. So you can see Germany is beginning to collapse and is beginning to sort of shrink, and the Soviet army is really pushing to get to major cities like Krakow in Poland, because if they can secure that city, that becomes a base for them, and clearly it's going to advance the Soviet mission of trying to take over and conquer the Third Reich. So the Soviets were not interested in liberating Auschwitz. They had very tactical and military objectives that they were trying to make. But while they were doing that, they did come to the gates of Auschwitz, and they had liberated previous camps in their march into the Third Reich and the occupied areas of the Third Reich, of which Poland certainly was. And when they arrived, the 322nd Rifles of the Soviet Army, when they arrived at the gates, the main gates of Auschwitz, they were absolutely horrified. They had not seen something quite like this before. The camp was liberated at about 3 in the afternoon. And when I say liberated, we can't really think of the inmates and the prisoners as being jubilant. I mean, they were far too emaciated for that. Some 60,000 of the prisoners had been sent on a death march out of the camp several days earlier. So when the Soviets arrived, there were there were about 700 people, maybe 1,000 people that were in the camp itself. A number of bodies. They found an awful lot of discarded clothes. They found 7 tons of human hair. It was very shocking, when they finally, and the crematoria had been all blown up, and the Nazis were trying to hide their crimes.
Let's talk a little bit about, we live in a time now where some of those survivors of Auschwitz and other places never speak of what happened to them. Others only recently have started speaking about it. But many of them are who were children then, are, elderly now, they're in their 90s. How important is it for people like you, people who don't have a direct, connection to this time or place, to do some of the work that you've done, which means research, study, telling the story, and actually going there? What's I guess what I'm asking here first, and I want you to take us there in a second, but what's our moral obligation today when we think of Auschwitz in particular?
Yeah, and when we think of these camps, and Auschwitz is emblematic of the entire Nazi genocidal system for sure, but we're losing our survivors. I mean, the survivors that we have now, they were teenagers when the Holocaust happens, which necessarily means that their awareness of the world is different. They didn't have children, for example. They had yet to start careers. So the survivors that we do have, and they're in their 90s at this point in time, their recollection of these places is just going to be a little different from, say, if you were to interview someone in the 1970s or in the 1980s who was, maybe in their 40s when they had survived. So it becomes vital that we sort of have people and institutions that can carry this dark knowledge forward, because a time is going to come, maybe sometime in the next 10 or 15 years, where there'll be a headline where last Holocaust survivor dies, and I wonder and I worry about what that means for the legacy of the Holocaust itself.
All right, you have been to these places, and your research for the books that you have written, and your forthcoming book as well, have been about this period in history. Tell me a little bit about going to Auschwitz. When were you there, and what was that like?
I'd been to a number of camps before I got to Auschwitz. I'd been to, for example, I'd been to Bergen-Belsen and to Dachau, and it was hard to see these places for sure, but those 2 camps reside in Germany, and I now sort of feel that, it's necessary, obviously, that these camps are preserved, but they're very sort of sterile, and most of the original buildings had been torn down, especially in the case of Bergen-Belsen. So when I got to Auschwitz for the first time, I sort of mentally prepared myself, like, you've been to a place similar to this, and it will be hard, but you'll be okay. And being at that place, I believe it changed me, and I think it kind of changed me on maybe even on a molecular level, because it's one thing to study that camp, but it's an entirely different thing to stand on the ramp where the families were separated and to see the ruins of the gas chambers and the crematoria. And I left Auschwitz for the first time because I'd spent about 30 hours doing research there, and I left after that first sort of stint of doing research, and I went back to my hotel room, and I closed the door, and I just burst into tears, and I'm not prone to that. I'm not ashamed of that, but I was surprised by the level of grief that overwhelmed me. And I've returned to Auschwitz several times since then, and that sense of, it's hard to quantify, the enormity of what happened there. It's you feel very small when you're walking around the place.
Other people come and take tours, and I was reading an interview with one of the tour guides who spoke openly about one of his concerns is that once people come and visit and light a candle and say that there's a risk of checking it off the list. I remembered, I paid my tribute, it's time to move on. For people who lived through this and for people who return to it, that's not the case. How do we continue to carry on, that knowledge, that history, into the decisions that we make on a daily basis? Like you said, it's just the scope of it is so overwhelming sometimes, all the time.
It is, and I'm aware that it's International Holocaust Remembrance Day, but given the work that I do, every day is International Holocaust Remembrance Day for me. which I think is a good thing, because when I see the disadvantaged and the dispossessed in my own, not just country, but my own corner of the world, I'm more likely to speak up, for example. If I was to see, say, a flyer that was promoting white supremacy, I'd take that down with no problem, tearing that down, for example. And I think, if there's a lesson about the Holocaust that we should take with us on a daily basis, it's that idea of confronting hatred directly when we see it.
Early.
And not just kind of shrugging our shoulders and saying, well, this is just some bad apples here, and this is causing pain to other people in our community and our country, and it's, I think, our obligation to stand up and to confront that when we see it happening.
Right, because people want to say never again, this should never happen again. But in China right now, 1 million Muslims are in internment camps, and you have examples from recent history that are horrific as well, of genocide and targeted evil inflicted upon certain people. What are some ways that we continue to fail in humanity to stop those things?
I think it's easy to sort of look at sort of what's happening and kind of turn away. One of the phrases that Hitler used that I'm aware of, he called the press the Lügenpresse, the lying press, and there's that echo today that I hear from our politicians, and I find that very, very worrying. And we have people in cages on the border, and I find that very worrying. And I think that these are things that that we should just be sort of aware of, and not to look at the Holocaust as that's something that happened in the past, and as you say, I can check off the box there, and I don't need to worry about it. I think that the Holocaust nudges us and should frustrate our comfort level with the current society that we live in.
Tell me, have people told you their stories? Have you been in the presence of survivors who have told you how they survived, who didn't survive, how they feel about their time in the camps?
Yeah, I've had the really good fortune, really the honor of interviewing some of the people that survived, and it's really, I feel, how do I encapsulate that? I'm just aware that each survivor is different. Right. Each survivor had a different sort of experience. You can be a Holocaust survivor, but not necessarily a survivor of a camp, for example. Maybe you evaded capture, which is equally as horrifying. Maybe you survived a ghetto. But I think that with the Holocaust, what I find is sort of universal in the people that I've talked to directly and with survivors that I've had the opportunity to watch maybe on interviews or in documentaries, is that they all really come to the same conclusion that the Holocaust is a wound that has never healed for them. They've just learned to carry it with them, and to be aware that it like any form of trauma, it will always be there. And the question is, well, how do I now go and live a life of meaning and worth?
In your research, for the people who inflicted, the people who ran the executions, is there a residual trauma to there? It has to damage someone's soul as well. And I'm not sympathizing with them, but I'm wondering what you've learned in your research to say what happens to people who are on the other side of something like that.
The perpetrators?
Yes.
And here we get into some muddy waters, because the Germans made the Jews at Auschwitz, because it was overwhelmingly the Jews that were murdered at Auschwitz. They made they were called the Sonderkommando, and they made them not put the gas in the chamber, but they were the ones that had to get the bodies out and to take them on. So those almost predominantly men, they were scarred obviously for the rest of their lives. But there's a really good book about the Nazi perpetrators themselves that were involved in something called the Einsatzgruppen, and these were shock squads that went out and they would gather up the Jews and shoot them in the forest. And it seems to be that there's this sense that that was the good old days. And if there is a sense of remorse, it's not expressed. And I'm no psychologist, but I find that really horrifying that these men were, many of, we talk about the Nuremberg trials, but very few Nazis were actually put on trial. It was mostly the upper echelon. Many of them just went back and they became bankers and accountants and, pharmacists or what have you, and they were able to get on with their lives. And there was no justice, and they didn't speak about it, and it didn't seem that what they did bothered them very much.
My guest is Patrick Hicks as we today remember the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. In our last 30 seconds, Patrick, tell us a little bit about your forthcoming book.
Well, I'm glad that thank you for bringing that up. When Auschwitz was that death march, when 60,000 people were sent on the death march, many of them went to a camp called Dora Mittelbau, which was in the center of Germany. And that involved a secret underground Nazi concentration camp where rockets were built. And the men that built those rockets, they were slave labor, but the men that oversaw them were like Werner von Braun, and they were brought to America, and they helped get us to the moon. So my next novel is talking about the morality and ethics of acquiring technology in a place like that.
Patrick Hicks, thank you so much for your time today. We look forward to hearing more about that book in the future.
Thank you, Lori.